Victoria Shachtay is only 23 years old when she's brutally killed. She had started asking the wrong questions, making the wrong phone calls. The quiet of a sleepy small-town afternoon is shattered when a suspicious package is delivered to a young woman's door. It looks to be a kind of gift, but it takes the life of a young mother. Is it a gang-related killing or something else?
It changed that town. It's not a small town anymore. It's got big city problems.
When the cops arrested him, I was pretty shocked.
Victoria Shachtay has discovered a secret that someone is willing to kill for. But how far does it go? Innisfail, Alberta, a small town nestled in the Calgary-Edmonton corridor, a highway junction, a place in between. But Innisfail has its own strong history. Settled in 1886 in part by a prominent Calgary coroner. Its name in Irish means Isle of Destiny. Now, almost 8,000 people live in this quiet town, a perfect area to raise a family. The Shachtays would know. Victoria is the youngest of 5.
She was more a tomboy than a little girl. When we were living in Didsbury, she climbed up the feed mill. Got up to the height where good sense took charge of her, but she couldn't climb down, so her brother had to go out and bring her down. She wasn't afraid of anything.
Vicky was pretty special to me. She loved animals. She was pretty close with her sister, Sarah, and she had a special place in her heart for her dad too, Victor.
One day in 2004, when Victoria is 16 years old, tragedy strikes.
She was with her boyfriend and a friend of hers and her friend's boyfriend, and they were coming back from Spruceview on Highway 54, and Vicky's boyfriend was driving, and he was doing way too fast. Like, he was probably doing 140.
Victoria is involved in a horrific car crash.
And most of where the damage, when you looked at the picture, was on the spot where Vicky was sitting.
And her head was sideways on the roof while she was upside down. She couldn't get out. And all the pressure, I think it took 45 minutes to an hour for the ambulance to arrive. And by the time that they arrived, there was so much pressure on her neck, it had snapped.
The news is devastating. Victoria still has her whole life ahead of her, but the accident leaves her with a shocking prognosis.
It made her into a quadriplegic.
While Victoria is in the hospital, the family learns that she's pregnant. To Victoria and her family's relief, the baby in utero survives the accident. 3 months after the crash, a healthy baby girl is born. In honor of the fact that they both survived the crash, Victoria names the baby girl Destiny.
Because it's destiny that she had the baby without complications.
I was actually very shocked that she was able to give birth naturally. I didn't think that she could, but she did.
Victoria's strength doesn't surprise the family, but it still impresses them.
She cared for people, all people, but mostly for Destiny, obviously. And she faced every problem just like she climbed up the grain elevator there. It was a new experience. She always tried to work it out for herself. In fact, down at the hospital in Edmonton, she figured out how to do things as a quadriplegic that they hadn't seen before. And they asked her if she minded getting it on film so that they could use the knowledge that they gained from her to help other paraplegics when they come in.
And it also inspired me to be better, work harder. I see my sister in a position where not too many people are in, and most people that are in that position will go in the opposite direction. And she fought so hard. It was just in her nature. It's our family's nature. That's what we do.
One of the first things the Shachtay family does after the birth of Destiny is look for a new, more accessible home. Finding a house that is move-in ready is difficult, so a couple that the family is friends with recommend a home builder they know.
He had renovated the house that her mom had lived in to make it more accessible.
The Shachtay family is introduced to Brian Malley, a construction manager who lives in the Innisfail area. Malley offers to build them an accessible home at cost. He can even move the Shachtay family into his recently deceased grandmother's house while they wait for the new home to be ready. It's even wheelchair accessible. Using the money from the sale of their family home, Malley oversees the construction of a new house for the Shachtays. And then a windfall comes that changes everything. In 2007, 3 years after the accident, Victoria is awarded a large financial settlement. The award is a huge sum for a family in need of assistance. Suddenly, Victoria's family no longer has the worry about the financial costs of Victoria's injuries.
And when she was old enough to move out on her own, I think she had just moved into her condo. The only thing that she bought for herself was her van. It was set up for her to be able to drive. That was her independence. She was so proud of that.
She was able to accomplish a lot more than she had expected.
By now, Malley is a close friend of the family. They learn that he works as a financial advisor for a wealth management company, investing money on behalf of a number of clients in the Innisfail community.
He promised to help us out. And oh, he's a money guy too, right? So he's right in there. He can help in all the facets of your life that you need.
Victoria transfers the entire amount of her settlement into an investment account he manages.
Her stepdad was friends with Brian, and because he had helped renovate the house, he trusted him.
He was very friendly, and we all got along and have a good time. We all considered him a family friend.
Malley suggests Victoria borrow an additional $264,000 to increase her returns. He pitches it as the more money she invests, the more she'll make. Brian Malley now has control of the entirety of Victoria's account. Things are seemingly going well for Victoria. She's raising Destiny, and with the help of her caregiver, Marlene, living independently. She's even regained a lot of the movement in one of her arms.
I would go over and spend weekends with her and Destiny. I had time for her and she had time for me. And Destiny was growing up, she had time. And we spent many happy hours together.
But there are some concerns about how Mally is handling her finances.
When she lived in Red Deer, right before she moved to Innisfail, Brian was withholding a lot of money. Like, Vicky would ask for money to pay the rent or bills or car payment, and it would take a lot of coaxing for him to actually give it to her.
On November 25th, 2011, Marlene finds an early Christmas gift mysteriously left out on the front step that morning. Feeling uneasy about the strange early Christmas gift, Marlene advises Victoria not to touch it. With no indication as to who sent it, they put the gift aside as she and Marlene head to Victoria's stepfather's house. He has a more accessible shower, so that morning, Marlene takes her there to wash up.
And then she says to me, "Dad, do you know anything about this package that was found on my step this morning?" I said to her, "Was there any identifying marks on it? Was it to say it was from or not?" She said, "Nothing. It's blank." And so my suspicious mind right away says, "Well, don't open it." I thought I had her convinced of that.
Marlene brings Victoria back home before her daughter Destiny is due to return. Marlene reminds Victoria of what her stepfather had just told her: do not touch the package and to call the police. Tragically, it's too late. Innisfail, Alberta, Isle of Destiny, a peaceful town in which to raise a family. But this peace is shattered. "23-year-old Victoria is a single mother and survivor of a terrible car crash. She receives a mysterious package in the mail. Victoria's neighbor, Evan Shilk, is a volunteer firefighter. He calls 911 and races to the house. Because of his training as a firefighter, Evan is able to run into the house and look for signs of life. He confirms that, tragically, Victoria hasn't survived the blast. Evan and Marlene wait for first responders to arrive. A member of law enforcement calls the family to inform them of the tragic news. Soon after, there's a knock on Victor Shachtay's door.
It's my daughter, Sarah. And she says, "Dad, they've killed Vicky." And I said, "What?"
We immediately got into the car and we drove to Innisfail and gave the police our statements.
After the RCMP are informed of the blast, a multi-unit team of investigators are hastily formed and dispatched to Victoria's home.
I got a phone call from my mom, so I turned the news on just in time to see a helicopter going over, telling me about an explosion in Innisfail, and I noticed it was at my sister's complex, and I lost it, right? That's my baby sister.
I'm still dumbfounded about what the heck happened.
My dad had to identify the body, so I don't know if he's gonna ever get over that, having to see his baby girl. Like, that was the youngest, was a baby of the family, right? And they were close, very close. So I saw my dad break. He was a broken man, and he was one of the strongest men that I knew, and I never ever wanted to see that from my dad again.
It's immediately clear. This is a homicide investigation. Victoria's death is not an accident.
The nature of the wounds that she suffered would certainly reveal a pattern that would give an origin. So the explosion occurred in one place and spread out from that location. So it would be simple to detect that the explosion occurred on her lap.
Before forensics or police can inspect the scene, the explosive disposal unit must search the house to ensure that there aren't any other explosive devices on the premises.
The explosive disposal unit is comprised of a group of officers who are specifically trained to detect and disarm explosive devices or properly dispose of explosive devices in a safe manner.
Not only does the team conduct a highly dangerous job while searching for a live bomb, they must do a preservation of the forensic evidence while doing so.
This isn't just the site of an explosion. It has to be considered in terms of being a crime scene. So there's an extensive amount of evidence that is located. It needs to be preserved. It also needs to be detected, and it can be scattered over a wide area.
The EDU find no further explosive devices. It's time for the forensic team to begin their work.
Forensic investigators are basically looking for anything that can be taken to the lab for further analysis. This would include objects such as fabric samples, piece of carpet, DNA, fingerprints, or even blood splatter.
They carefully bag everything that can be taken into evidence. Miraculously, the note and tape attached to the package has survived the blast. It, too, is bagged.
Soon investigators find what they believe are materials that are from a bomb. These items would include a galvanized steel pipe, smokeless gunpowder, and a lantern battery. This is extremely important evidence to retrieve because once back at the lab, they can fully examine and confirm accuracy of the items that were used as a detonation device.
The Major Crimes Unit of the RCMP are the next to scour the scene. They take photographs and try to piece together a timeline. Together, investigators collect hundreds of pieces of evidence. Corporal Kanwardeep Dayhill with the Major Crime Unit is the lead investigator on the case. Detectives start interviewing everyone in Victoria's circle. Investigators interview Victoria's financial advisor, Brian Malley. When detectives ask about the investments he's made on Victoria's behalf, Malley is candid. He tells them that the money is all gone. Malley informs the detectives that the account is drained. Victoria only has a few $1,000s left in her account. He explains that when Victoria first received the money, they sat down together to come up with a monthly budget. But the second year after the payment, the market becomes unfavorable. He asks her to decrease her spending, but she was unable to do so. According to Malley, Victoria was giving a lot of money to her family members, including her sister and one of her brothers. This is very surprising news. It's a lot of money to have lost in a short amount of time. Investigators ask Malley where he was during the window of the time around the bombing.
Malley tells detectives that the evening before the explosion, he was traveling from Red Deer to Innisfil to see a colleague where he would pick up some building supplies.
Malley claims that after getting back home that night, he went out to get some dinner and then returns to watch TV until bed.
His wife's in Edmonton at the ballet. On the morning of the detonation, Brian drives to Edmonton on business.
Later, investigators are contacted by Brian Malley, who tells them that he has information on a new, promising lead, that there may be a drug connection to the bombing involving a family member. According to Malley, Victoria's brother has addiction issues and associates with drug traffickers. He may even be one himself. Malley suggests to the detectives that Victoria's death is a drug hit, retaliation against her brother for a deal gone sour.
One of my younger brothers had a crack habit earlier. That was ridiculous to even state that. They don't go after family members. If you owe money, they're coming after you.
Lead major crimes investigator Sergeant Dayhill soon discovers another possible lead. This one is also connected to the drug world. Victoria had called the RCMP to report her neighbors. The building was a high-traffic drug market, and she had called it in. Investigators look into whether or not the bomb may have been a revenge hit.
Gangs have been known in the past to use explosives or bombs to either intimidate witnesses or to affect the abilities of their rivals. It's completely possible that this could be connected to gang activity.
As investigators look into this lead further, they also turn their attention back to Brian Malley. They discover that the investment manager may not have been entirely forthcoming with them during their first interview. It's Brian's recklessness, not Victoria's, that leads to her financial losses. Investigators learn that Brian invests close to 92% of Victoria's entire portfolio in one highly risky stock without adequately informing her. When the stock collapses, so does Victoria's wealth.
Investing someone's entire stock portfolio in a single stock without properly advising them of the associated risks is a serious breach of fiduciary duties. It is in contravention of the regulations of the Alberta Securities Commission.
Victoria calls Brian's office to transfer money from her investment into her checking account. The receptionist tells her that Brian's on a fishing trip, but she adds that he wouldn't have been able to transfer from that account anyway. It's being closed due to a lack of funds.
On the 21st of November, I got a phone call from my sister saying, "I'm so sorry, I can't give you no money. Apparently I'm broke." And I'm like, "What do you mean you're broke?" She goes, "I don't know. I phoned to the office. Brian wasn't there. His secretary had looked at my file and said that the file was closed. I have to figure out what's going on."
Victoria has no idea that her money is gone. Suddenly, she has nothing. Detectives learn that one of the reasons for this is that Malley has been hiding the losses caused by his recklessness. To hide the fact that he lost her money, Brian transfers a total of $44,000 of his own money into her account over 2 years. The only reason Victoria finds out is because she happened to call while he was away. Victoria visits Malley's office a number of times, demanding to be paid back.
Well, she's starting to push back, letting him know that she's aware of his deception, and he probably perceives this as a threat.
Corporal Dayhill now has enough to begin surveillance on Malley. An explosive device delivered in a Christmas gift bag takes the life of 23-year-old Victoria Shachtay. A multidisciplinary team of highly trained experts comb through the debris to find evidence. They're now looking for additional information that may point towards someone who would want her dead. Investigators turn their attention to Victoria's financial planner, Brian Malley, whose reckless investments have emptied her account. the RCMP Major Crimes Unit conducts a surveillance operation on Malley. During the operation, detectives secure a napkin that Brian throws out at a fast food restaurant.
The likelihood of the perpetrator's DNA likely surviving the blast is slim, but just in this case, they would like a comparison.
Financial records from as far back as July show that Brian had been purchasing the same materials that the bomb is made of. This means that Malley had been planning this murder for 4 months. A piece of galvanized steel pipe, gunpowder, end cap, light switch, lantern battery, and tiny light bulbs found at the scene are all on Malley's shopping list. Meanwhile, the forensic unit on the investigation surprises everyone. Members of the forensic team are able to lift DNA from the card and tape that had been adhered to the explosive device.
Finding DNA evidence in an explosion is like finding a diamond in the rough. It's that one off chance that investigators and professionals hope for. It's the evidence that you weren't likely thinking you will find.
Investigators compare this DNA sample with the one they collect from Brian at the fast food restaurant. The DNA found on the bomb is consistent with Malley's, but not exact.
It's likely that experts found a high comparison value of maybe 50 to 70%, but the match is not conclusive.
On May 25, 2012, Brian Malley is arrested for 1 count of first-degree murder and 2 counts related to causing an explosion and sending a person an explosive device.
When the cops arrested him, it was 6 months to the day. And when they came over to tell me who they arrested, I was pretty shocked.
He was the last person that anybody would think. He was a friend of the family. He was at the funeral.
Once I found out it was Brian, then a sudden rage started boiling. Not only Vicky, it was for Destiny, too. He took away her mother and took away her future, for God's sakes.
1 month after his arrest, Brian is released on a $20,000 bond. He and his wife move in with his mother-in-law in Edmonton. Although Malley has been charged, investigators still look at other possible suspects.
It is important that investigators keep an open mind, even though they may have charged a suspect with an offense. There may be other people involved. There may be other evidence to be gathered. The investigation doesn't come to an end just because a charge has been laid.
When examining Victoria's call to report a drug house next door, detectives learned that Victoria had done so anonymously. There's no way her neighbors could know it was her. Besides, she made the call years ago. Given these factors, the likelihood that it's a revenge drug hit is very slim. Investigators also examine the possibility that the bombing is a targeted killing by her brother's rivals. Using the resources at their disposal, the MCU find nothing to support this theory. They turn their attention back to Malley. Investigators suspect that Malley spends months building a bomb in a rented garage in order to eliminate a client who's become a major problem. Malley complains to associates that Victoria is a burden to him. He describes her as stubborn and lazy because, according to him, she overspends and refuses to get a job.
These kinds of comments shed light on the attitude that this person had towards his clients. Very flippant, callous, almost disrespectful regard for his client and their money.
Investigators look at what kind of person Malley really is. Detectives learn something surprising. Malley used to be one of them. From 1979 to 1982, Malley is a constable with the Edmonton Police Force. But after 3 years, he's dismissed for conduct unbecoming of an officer. Investigators also discover that Malley marries his first wife when she was 16. They divorce after she accuses him of threatening violence and death against her and their daughter. Malley's second marriage ends when he became involved with a co-worker, who eventually marries him. The co-worker, Christine, is in fact the branch manager at the investment office for which he works. She is supposed to be overseeing his investment decisions.
This is a serious conflict of interest when your wife is your manager because they're the ones that are supposed to be overseeing your decisions. This is also against the regulations of the Securities Commission.
Meanwhile, the community, many whom trust their hard-earned life savings to Malley, watch in shock, realizing this prominent community member is not who he says he is.
Most of the people in town knew and liked Mr. Malley. I think they felt betrayed and hurt.
It changed that town. It's not a small town anymore. It's got big city problems.
In January 2015, Brian Malley's murder trial begins. Brian Malley is arrested and charged with first-degree murder, as well as 2 other counts related to creating and sending an explosive device. A month later, he's released on $20,000 bail. Detectives learn more about Malley's past, including that he was a cop dismissed for conduct unbecoming of an officer. They discover that the woman in charge of managing his work as an investor is, in fact, his wife.
It's a huge conflict of interest, and it contravenes the regulations of the Security Commission's rules around wealth management.
On January 15th, Brian Malley's trial begins. The Crown calls a number of witnesses, including Marlene, Victoria's caregiver. She testifies that only the night before, she and Victoria were celebrating her new working visa with a pizza party. Marlene states that 10 days before her death, Victoria called Malley, demanding the financial advisor pay back the money he allegedly owes her. She also recounts how she tells Victoria not to open the package and the trauma of being in the apartment while the bomb went off. It's Corporal Dayhill's turn to testify. Jurors hear about the inconclusive match between the DNA found on the bomb and the sample they pick up during the surveillance operation. Corporal Dayhill testifies he learned that Malley had been speaking disrespectfully of Victoria in the months before her death. Malley complains that she's lazy and a drain on the system.
I bit my tongue pretty hard because that was the one time in the courtroom that I actually wanted to scream out. And I didn't. I'm proud of myself for not doing it because that was hard.
Corporal Dayhill also testifies that months after the explosion, a pipe matching the description of that used in the bomb was dug up from the residence of Malley's mother-in-law. It only has one end cap, and Malley purchases only one end cap. The pipe used in the bomb has 2.
Apparently, they did find a bunch of different attempts. He had been working on it for a bit. It was definitely a lot of thought went into this.
This evidence is circumstantial. It's certainly not conclusive in any way, but it's definitely something the defense is going to rely on in an attempt to create reasonable doubt.
The defense also argues that because Malley is an avid hunter, it makes sense that he would purchase gunpowder. Same as with the other materials used, the pipe, small light bulbs, and batteries, all materials that a home contractor would have.
The defense ends up calling a pipe fitter to testify that these kinds of materials would be normally used in every day by a home contractor.
This is what they think he's going to say.
However, what the pipe fitter actually ends up saying is that he's never seen a pipe like this used for everyday use. So it completely backfires for the defense.
When asked why he had said this before, he claims he didn't recall saying it and that he was probably very nervous. About 2 weeks into the trial, the judge receives some disturbing information. A security guard and 7 jurors express complaints to the judge. The reason is shocking. The group comes forward to the judge to explain that Brian's wife, Christine, has been secretly recording and taking photos of them as they exit and enter the courtroom. Juror 9 is interviewed by the judge 3 separate times. Each time she expresses concern for her safety and the safety of her family. She tells the judge that she's concerned about what Christine might do with the pictures, including that she might make them public. But despite her worries, at the end of the 3rd interview, when the judge formally asks, she confirms that she can still carry on her duty according to her oath. The judge doesn't relieve her, and the juror doesn't ask to be relieved.
Tampering with a jury is a very serious offense because it can intimidate jurors and prevent them from making an unbiased decision, which is crucial to the functioning of our legal system. And so Christine's conduct in this case comes very close to qualifying as an offense under the criminal code as obstruction of justice. The judge ends up excluding Christine from the courtroom, so she's not allowed to enter the courtroom at any time unless she is acting as a witness.
Although the case against Brian is strong, his defense is confident. The jury deliberates for 6 hours.
6 hours really isn't a lot of time for a jury to deliberate. So regardless of the outcome, it means that they're really certain one way or the other.
The verdict is in. Guilty of first-degree murder, as well as the additional 2 counts. Brian is sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years.
And I was sitting at the back of the seats. When they started reading out the verdict, I moved from the back to the front row right behind them. And that's one thing that I still don't understand why they did it. But they let him kiss his wife and his daughter goodbye. They didn't let me kiss Vicky goodbye. They couldn't, but they let him.
The guilty verdict and the fact that the guilty verdict was arrived at so quickly means that the jury was very convinced by the prosecution's evidence.
But the defense has a strong case for appeal. The verdict is in. Guilty of first-degree murder, as well as 2 other counts related to creating and sending an explosive device. Brian's defense team appeals.
Brian appeals on the grounds that the jurors were clearly afraid of Christine because of her actions, specifically juror number 9, and that because of that, they had an inherent bias towards him. So this ground does have the potential to be effective. This argument could also work against them because common sense would indicate that intimidation could actually cause a juror to be biased in the other direction by causing them to be fearful for their own safety if they convict.
Brian's defense uses juror number 9 as part of their argument, stating that the jury member clearly expresses that they were in fear of their own safety and that of their families after discovering Christine's activities. The defense argues that this clearly biases the juror. If they're scared of the accused wife, how can they claim not to be biased? In the appeal, the defense also claims that investigators didn't do enough to look at alternative suspects.
While it's an argument that does seem to have some teeth to it, in the end it is dismissed, and part of the reason why it's dismissed is because this wasn't raised by the defense at the time of the trial.
A judge rules that the appeal should be dismissed. 2 years later, the Supreme Court of Canada declines to hear the appeal. Malley is out of options. Malley has seemingly been a successful community investor, growing the wealth of those in and around Innisfail. But soon after his conviction, a class action lawsuit is filed against Malley that sheds light on this image.
Many of them retirees who had entrusted substantial funds to this man. And now, in their later life, they were dismayed, angry, frustrated. They'd taken money out or borrowed money to entrust with this man. And in the end, he ended up doing all of them wrong.
As a result of this case, Malley's clients also launched a lawsuit against him and his former company for the amount of $50 million, which is a huge amount.
The suit claims that Malley didn't inform his clients of the level of risk he was taking when investing their assets. They show that Malley sold the same securities repeatedly in order to increase his commission, didn't disclose the conflict of interest when his manager became his wife, and persuaded a large number of clients to borrow money to increase their investments, with the intent to increase his commission. The suit shows that Malley squandered almost an entire community's life savings. In 2015, an undisclosed settlement is approved by a judge. The scope of the effect on the community is deep, but typical of the rural Albertan community, they brush themselves off and move on. Victoria's family is still deeply affected by the loss.
As a trauma response, my brain has removed most of my childhood memories. I didn't feel anything of it.
It's gotten better over the years, but you never forget and you never stop missing.
Meanwhile, Destiny's loving grandfather and her aunt are taking care of her like they would their own children, ensuring that the love and joy of her mother is passed on to another generation.